Have you ever been in a situation where you felt like there was absolutely nothing you could do? Like no matter how hard you tried, you just couldn't escape it? Well, if you have, then you know exactly what the Blackwood family had to endure during the winter of 2011 when they heard terrifying voices coming from inside their own home. And believe it or not, it got worse from there. So let's take a look back at what happened and see what we can learn. The year is 2011, and the location is rural Pennsylvania. For decades, the isolated farmhouse has stood vacant, falling into disrepair. But now it's being rented out to a young couple, Paul and Lisa Blackwood, along with their 2 children, ages 13 and 9. Not knowing that the home they just moved into may very well be hiding a secret, they unpacked their boxes and began making the house feel like home. As weeks passed, they started to hear noises. At first, they weren't too bad, just some old house settling sounds, and the wind howling through the cracks of the boarded-up windows. But then, the temperature dropped, and so did their spirits. Now, every night around 4 a.m., they would hear voices coming from the basement. At first, it sounded like whispering and muffled footsteps. But soon, it became apparent that these were voices like distinct voices, carrying on conversations about things they couldn't quite make out. Sometimes it sounded like they were arguing. Other times it was just laughter, but always it was menacing. After hearing the commotion for several nights, Paul decided enough was enough and went down to investigate. As he descended the creaking stairs into the dank, dimly lit basement, his flashlight revealed walls covered with grime and peeling paint. Cobwebs hung from the ceiling, and the stale air was thick with the smell of mildew. There was a single bare light bulb hanging from a cord, casting long shadows that danced with the dust motes floating in the still air. Tools lay scattered across a workbench, and boxes were stacked precariously in the corner, but nothing seemed out of place. He checked behind boxes, under loose floorboards, and in the far corner, where the furnace rumbled to life, but found nothing. He even called the police, who searched the premises, but found nothing unusual either. It seemed as though the only possible explanation was that it was all in their heads. But as the weeks went by, the voices only grew louder, and one morning, Paul even swore he saw movement out of the corner of his eye. To try and catch whatever it was that was making these sounds, he set up a motion-activated audio recorder, then waited. For the next few days, he checked the recordings only to find nothing but static. But then, it happened again. The volume of the voices increased, and they were joined by others. Screams echoed through the house at night, and footsteps pounded on the floor above the basement. The family huddled together in their beds, listening to the cacophony, until dawn broke and the sounds faded away. In the end, Paul was driven to the point of no return. When he listened to the recording, he heard the presence of otherworldly entities moving about in the basement. What exactly is going on here? Let's find out. At first, the house looked normal enough from the outside. It was a typical colonial-style home, with a gabled roof and white paint, although much of it had peeled away over the years. Ivy crept up the side of the house and dead leaves gathered in the yard. But it was the isolation that truly made it ominous. Situated on a dirt road, surrounded by dense woods, the house stood alone, cut off from the rest of the world. A chill wind whistled through the trees, and the distant caw of crows echoed through the stillness. When Paul entered the house, he hoped that the interior would reveal a different story. A history of happy families and warm hearths. But instead, he was met with the lingering specter of neglect and decay. The air hung heavy with the scent of mildew and dust as he walked through the rooms, each step echoing in the cavernous spaces. Wallpaper peeled from the walls. Window panes were shattered and cobwebs draped across the doorways like shrouds. In the kitchen, the linoleum floor was stained and cracked. In the living room, a chandelier hung precariously from the ceiling. And in the bedrooms, the beds were stripped and the closets empty. The house seemed to hold its breath, waiting for someone to awaken its slumbering secrets. But as the days turned into weeks, the sounds followed him everywhere. They whispered to him from the walls, moaned in his ear as he slept, and seemed to mock him with their disembodied laughter. The house, once a sanctuary, became a prison. He was trapped in a nightmare from which there was no escape. And the voices, they grew louder. The night before, he heard chains dragging metal moans and inhuman screams. Something heavy thudded against the floor above the basement, causing the entire house to tremble. Fear gnawed at his insides, cold and relentless. Sleep offered no respite, and his dreams were haunted by visions of the house, its darkness pressing in on him, suffocating him. So, when the sun finally rose, he rushed to the basement to investigate. There, in the dim light, he saw something that made the blood drain from his face. The motion detector, which had been sitting innocently on the floor the day before, was now lying on its back, its lens shattered, its wires torn from the casing. The batteries, which had been new and untouched, were now leaking acid onto the concrete floor. Paul stared at the device, his mind struggling to comprehend what had happened here. Had someone broken into the house in the middle of the night, smashed the recorder, and then vanished without a trace? Or was there something more sinister at work? Something that defied rational explanation? The thought sent a shiver down his spine. He quickly called the police, who arrived promptly, but found no evidence of a break-in. They examined the recorder, tested the batteries, and even dusted for fingerprints, but came up with nothing. The officers' puzzled faces and shrugged shoulders only added to Paul's growing sense of dread. It was as if the house itself was guarding its secrets jealously, determined to keep its darkness buried from the light of day. It was at that moment that Paul realized he was truly alone, trapped in a nightmare from which there was no escape. The house had revealed its dark heart, and there was no turning back. Now, as the weeks passed, the voices grew louder, more frequent and more menacing. Sometimes they spoke in hushed tones, their words just beyond Paul's comprehension. At other times, their voices rose in angry shouts, echoing through the halls of the house like tormented souls. And then there were the footsteps, heavy, deliberate steps that pounded on the wooden floorboards above the basement, as if someone were walking directly over his head. The house, once a refuge, had become a prison, its four walls closing in on him, its roof pressing down like a heavy lid on a coffin. He found himself jumpy, constantly on edge, unable to relax or enjoy the simple pleasures of life. The once comfortable home had transformed into a battleground of fear and paranoia, and Paul was caught in the middle, desperately trying to hold on to his sanity. One evening, as darkness fell and the shadows grew long, Paul snapped. He couldn't take it anymore. The whispering voices, the heavy footsteps, the feeling of being watched. He grabbed a baseball bat and ventured into the basement. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and decay. The single bare light bulb hanging from the ceiling cast long, distorted shadows that danced on the grimy walls. Paul's heart pounded in his chest as he descended the creaking stairs, step echoed in the silence, amplifying the sound of his own heartbeat. In the dim light, he saw a movement in the corner of his eye, a fleeting shadow that disappeared as quickly as it appeared. Paul froze, his breath catching in his throat. Was he losing his mind? Or was there something else at play here? His eyes darted around the room, searching for the source of the disturbance. The silence was deafening, broken only by the pounding of his own heart. Suddenly, a noise echoed through the basement, a heavy thud followed by the sound of dragging metal. Paul swung the baseball bat, his heart pounding in his chest. Then, just as suddenly, it stopped. Had he imagined it? Was it just the house settling? Or was there something down there watching him, waiting for him to leave? With trembling hands, Paul reached for the light switch. The single bare bulb flickered and then burst, plunging the basement into darkness. Paul stumbled backward, his foot catching on a loose floorboard. He fell, the baseball bat clattering away from him. Panic seized him. Then a soft, scratching sound began near his feet. It grew steadily louder, accompanied by a low, guttural growl. Paul scrambled back, his fingers scraping along the rough concrete wall. He was trapped, his back against the cold, damp stone, his eyes wide with terror. The growling grew louder, more intense. Then, a low voice slithered into his ear. "Get out," it hissed, its tone dripping with menace. "Get out while you can." Paul didn't need to be told twice. He scrambled to his feet and fled, the voice echoing behind him, promising torment and despair. As he stumbled up the basement stairs, he heard a loud crash followed by the sound of heavy footsteps pounding up the stairs behind him. Paul ran, his lungs burning, his heart pounding in his chest. He burst through the front door and didn't stop running until he reached the safety of his car. But the ordeal was far from over. Every night the voices grew louder, more insistent, taunting him, tormenting him. He tried everything to make them stop, but nothing worked. The house was driving him insane. And then one night, as he sat huddled in bed with his wife and children, trying to ignore the cacophony, he heard a knock. It wasn't the sound of footsteps or dragging chains, but a distinct knock, as if someone were at the door. He listened intently. There it was again, a firm, deliberate knock. Could it really be someone up there? With shaking hands, he got out of bed and slowly climbed the stairs to the attic. The musty smell of old wood and decay filled his nostrils as he pushed the door open. The attic was dark, cluttered with old furniture and boxes, and the only light came from the sliver of moon shining through a grimy window. Paul stepped inside, his eyes adjusting to the gloom. He saw the source of the knocking, a loose board near the eaves. Relieved but shaken, he closed the door and returned to his family. But as the months passed, the disturbances continued. Unexplained objects moved, lights flickered, and doors creaked open on their own. And then there was the scratching. It seemed to come from within the walls, as if something were trying to claw its way out. Paul tried to dismiss it, blaming drafts or settling pipes. But deep down, he knew there was something sinister at play. He'd had enough. He packed his bags, his wife and kids, and left the house as fast as he could, never looking back. That's all for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. Remember, this is based on a true story, and if you want to know more about similar cases, please follow. Thanks for watching.